Okay, so we are going to talk today about some background information on William Shakespeare. I like to start with a good background of Shakespeare because you guys are going to have to read him quite a bit in high school. This doesn't just stop in my class. Typically, you guys read Shakespeare about every year. Sometimes maybe two plays a year whenever you get up to junior or senior level, depending on which classes you take. So first of all, we really emphasize Shakespeare in language arts because he's considered to be one of the most influential writers in English literature. He created a lot of language. We've talked about that a little bit in class, but whenever he couldn't find a word that he was wanting to express whatever he was trying to express, he would just kind of make up a new one. And then those became popular words and are a lot of times are still used today. This was an ability for him because there wasn't a dictionary at the time, so he could kind of, play around. We know a lot about him because Elizabethan England kept very detailed records because it was a police state. According at least to legend, he was born on April 23rd, 1564, which is a very, very long time ago, considering that pretty much every teenager in America and the rest of the Western civilization still reads his plays today. And then our first record that we have of him is his actual baptism. So typically baptisms would happen about 3 days before or about 3 days after the baby was born. So we assume that it was maybe April 23rd. And if that is the case, if he was born on April 23rd, then that actually means that he also died on his birthday in 1616. His parents were John Shakespeare and Mary Arden was her maiden name, and then eventually Mary Shakespeare after she married John. And then his dad was a glover, so he made gloves. And then later he became involved in politics and became mayor. He also got involved in this illegal wool trade, which doesn't sound very, exciting, but probably was for the time. He was the first surviving child that John and Mary had because they had lost two daughters beforehand. And that was pretty common in this time period. A lot of children did not make it. And his hometown is Stratford-upon-Avon in Britain. And British towns tend to have strange names. So that's why that one is may sound a little weird to you guys. So his childhood, Shakespeare's childhood. First of all, there was a lot of back and forth because there was a lot of turmoil going on in the royal family. And so there was a lot of turnover between the kings and the queens of England. And as new monarchs would come into reign, they would tend to change their religion, maybe from Catholicism to Protestantism. And that created a lot of turmoil because since they were the reigning monarch, everybody was expected to follow whatever religion it was that the king or queen said was the national religion. So Shakespeare's family, they were Catholics. So whenever Queen Elizabeth was in power, who was a Protestant, and she declared the national religion to be Protestantism, they were not supposed to practice Catholicism. But a lot of people still continued to do that in secret, which was pretty daring and pretty bold because Queen Elizabeth liked to know exactly what was going on in her country, and she had a ton of spies. There was also a very important movement in this time period called mystery plays, which were plays that would tell about stories from the Bible. And this probably had a really big impact on Shakespeare because this was some of the only theater that was allowed to be produced in the time period because it was religious based and faith based. And so that was an exception. But other types of theater and plays were considered to be sinful. And so Queen Elizabeth wouldn't really typically allow them. Shakespeare was upper class. And that, contributed to him being kind of from a privileged background. His education, he started school at age 7. This is whenever England was undergoing an educational revolution. This is kind of part of the fact that the printing press had been recently invented. And so books were more widely accessible. And so reading became more of a skill that people needed to know, especially people who were, upper class like Shakespeare. They were the most literate generation so far, but only boys were allowed to go to school in this time. Girls had to stay home and learn how to be future housewives and mothers. He, at least most likely attended, he's assumed to have attended the King's New School, which was the local school in Stratford-upon-Avon. And they were taught grammar and godliness, so it was a Christian-based school. And they went to school from 6 a.m. until 5 p.m., which is too long. I think we can all agree. He had to learn Latin. He also had to study poetry, and he really liked Ovid. And he had to quit school at age 13 because his parents needed help. So he went and worked as an apprentice for his father in making gloves. Whenever he was 18, he married Anne Hathaway. And no, she is not the actress. She just happens to have the same name. She was 26 and he was 18. It's quite a big age difference. And that was in 1582. It's kind of a little scandalous because Anne was pregnant before they got married. She gave birth to her daughter 6 months after they were married, and they named her Susanna. So there's kind of some argumentation among Shakespearean scholars about whether or not he really wanted to marry her, and maybe he just kind of did it because she was pregnant, and that was kind of what he was expected to do. 2 years later, Anne gave birth to twins. Hamnet was Shakespeare's only son, one of those twins, and then the other twin was Judith, his second daughter. And then Hamnet, who is very, very close in name to one of Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet, his only son died whenever he was only 11 from some sort of unknown causes. We're not really sure what. But like we said, this was really common at the time period because we didn't have, our healthcare was not quite as advanced at this point in time. They refer to 1585 to 1592 as the lost years because we don't have a lot of documentation, so we don't really know very much what he was up to. Eventually, though, he moved to London, and he still stayed married to his wife, Anne, but he was living mostly in London and then going back to see them every now and then. And so Anne was kind of expected to stay home with the kids while he was off in London, partying and having a good time and writing plays and drinking. He was a partier, Shakespeare. He also is maybe believed to not be the most faithful because a lot of his poems mention this dark lady that he perhaps had an affair with. But he still made sure that Anne was provided for and always sent money home and everything like that. His plays. So they were first performed by the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then eventually that became the leading play company in London. After Queen Elizabeth died, there was more acceptance of plays, and so they became the King's Men, and the new king really enjoyed their plays and would invite them to put them on where he was so that he could watch. His 3 types of plays: histories, comedies, and tragedies. And then remember, there's a 4th genre, but that happened later in his experience. He started to write tragic comedies, which would combine the two. At one point, they were pretty daring because whenever they started to go after the playhouses, Shakespeare and his play company decided that they weren't going to put up with that and they weren't going to be ruled by the king. And so the king's rule only extended to the river, the Thames River. And so basically in like a few days, they completely deassembled the playhouse, which is a huge theater, and then moved it across the river so that they would be out of the jurisdiction and not have to listen to all of the rules about, holiness and when plays could happen. And, the church liked to keep tabs on them because they thought plays were sinful. Remember, we've talked about how, going to see a play during Shakespeare's time was kind of a guilty pleasure. It was something that you didn't really want to broadcast. So people would go across the river to kind of do all of these things that were considered sinful, or maybe not like the most, the things that you didn't really want people to know that you were into, but were entertaining. So Shakespeare's plays were part of that, but also there were theaters where they would chain up bears and basically make a bear fight a person. And it was called bear baiting. And so this is something that was like not considered highbrow. Like you didn't dress up and go to the theater like people do now. I have a list of, most of the Shakespearean plays that we teach in class. Of course, you guys are starting with Romeo and Juliet, which is the most famous, most commonly read. And then also the Globe Theater was built entirely from wood and straw. And then at one point they got the really bright idea to fire cannons to make the canon sounds realistic, which of course